Read along, we'll be taking a look at Wicked History, Stalin. Chapter 5, Red Alert. The Bolsheviks fight to impose communism on the Russian people. The October Revolution put Lenin, Stalin, and the Bolsheviks firmly in charge of Petrograd, but their work was just beginning. They needed to establish control over 180 million people and an area twice the size of the United States. As the Bolsheviks cracked down on their opposition, the Russian people got a bitter taste of their future under communist rule. By the end of 1917, the Bolsheviks had already made plenty of enemies. Landlords bitterly resented the peasants who now worked the land as if it were their own. Capitalists despised the laborers who had taken over their factories. All across the country, wealthy and middle-class Russians feared for their property and their lives. Foreign leaders were equally alarmed by the Bolsheviks. If rough-handed peasants and factory workers were allowed to seize power in Russia, would Great Britain or the United States be next? According to British Minister of War Winston Churchill, the Bolshevik Revolution had to be, quote, strangled in its cradle. With help from Great Britain, France, the US, and Japan, anti-Bolshevik groups in Russia organized resistance to the communists. Joined by thousands of soldiers from the Tsar's former army, they formed a loose band of forces known as the White Army. Lenin, Stalin, and the Bolshevik leadership moved quickly to prepare for civil war. Lenin's commissar for foreign affairs, Leon Trotsky, signed a peace agreement with the Germans and the Austrians and pulled Russia out of World War I. To replace the all-volunteer Red Guards, Trotsky formed a disciplined new communist force, the Red Army. As the Red Army began to do battle with the Whites, Lenin imposed communism on the Russian people. He dissolved the parliament and declared that the Soviet councils now governed the country. From their new capital in Moscow, the Bolsheviks took over land from monasteries and wealthy landowners. Banks were seized by government managers, and all factories were turned over to the Soviets. Leon Trotsky, with Cain, and Stalin were bitter rivals within the Bolshevik Party. Trotsky believed the communist experiment in Russia would fail unless it became a, quote, permanent revolution that spread to Western Europe and beyond. Stalin criticized Trotsky's ideas as, quote, permanent hopelessness. Lenin called his new system war communism, and it didn't look anything like the workers' paradise described by Karl Marx. The Bolsheviks outlawed strikes and told police to shoot workers who defied the ban. Communist Party workers confiscated surplus crops from peasants to feed the Red Army. Food and other essential goods were all to be controlled and distributed by the government. To defend the revolution's new policies, Lenin created a ruthless security organization known as the Cheka. Its job would be to hunt down all enemies of the working class and even to carry out executions. The Cheka's leaders weren't secretive about their goals or their methods. Without mercy, without sparing, we will kill our enemies in scores of hundreds, they declared in a Red Army newspaper. Let them drown themselves in their own blood. In May 1918, Stalin went on a mission that would reveal the tactics of the new regime in all its brutality. Government food supplies were running dangerously low, and his job was to squeeze more grain from the peasants in the fertile farmlands of the Caucasus. He traveled south from Moscow to Tsaritsyn, which he would later name Stalingrad, and took command of the military forces in that area. In Tsaritsyn, Stalin proceeded to terrorize the very people the Bolsheviks claimed as their allies, the peasants. He sent army units to demand grain and other provisions from the dirt-poor farmers. Villages that failed to deliver would be burned to the ground. Anyone who resisted was to be arrested or shot on the spot. You must be absolutely merciless, he explained to a comrade. Stalin was equally merciless to the Red Army troops under his command. He racked up huge casualties to secure victories against the Whites. At the first hint of dissent from his officers, he lashed out in fury. Many of the Red Army's commanders had recently served under the Tsar, and Stalin was convinced they were traitors. He had dozens of officers shot or locked up on suspicion of sabotaging the war effort. As the acts of brutality piled up, Lenin and Trotsky grew to mistrust Stalin, but they also admitted that he was essential to the revolution. Although Stalin was hot-headed, dangerous, and stubborn, he got things done. And his use of terror was just an extreme version of the official Bolshevik policy. "How can you make a revolution without firing squads?" Lenin said. "If we can't shoot enemy saboteurs, what kind of revolution is this? Nothing but talk and a bowl of mush." By 1921, Stalin's services on the battlefront were no longer needed. The bulk of the White Army had been defeated. The people of the former Russian Empire were at peace for the first time in 7 years. During that time, their country had been through a great upheaval. Their Tsar had been deposed and then executed by the Bolsheviks in 1918. New leaders had seized power, promising to rule in the interests of the poor. But many people suspected they had simply exchanged one tyrannical government for another.